Was good, my boys? At your boy Apollos, and today we're gonna be talking about Jesus' empty tomb guards, the evidence that nobody's talking about. Yeah. So over here I have a thumbnail of Bart Ehrman as a clown Roman soldier, and if you ever see this Dr. Ehrman, no disrespect intended. You know, it's just clickbait's the name of the game in YouTube. But basically, the whole idea of today's presentation is, you know, a lot of times when we've looked at Jesus' empty tomb guards, we've relied as apologists on the Matthean internal consistency as a defense for why there was an empty tomb guard. And I thought, well, how about we take a step back and just look at deterrents against grave robbery in all of Greco-Roman antiquity in general. And so that was basically the force of the inspiration for today's presentation. And I hope you guys will enjoy it. First, we're going to be looking at the relevance of guards in Jesus' empty tomb narrative and explain, you know, the history, the background behind what modern defenses for empty tomb guards look like. Then we're going to look at enforcement of Roman law against tomb robbery, the community understanding, the religio-social context, generic tomb inscriptions and edicts against grave robbery, and then Roman and Ptolemaic Egypt. Egypt is a typical place for grave robbers to try to rob the next King Tut, hence the Indiana Jones series. Jewish burial customs, where I'm going to give 6 arguments for Jesus' burial / empty tomb. It was brought to my attention recently that the burial is different from the empty tomb as in terms of its acceptance in critical academia, namely that the burial of Jesus is well established as a minimal fact, whereas the empty tomb, we're still at 80% of critical scholars, according to Habermas's survey. Note on Yehohanan, Dr. Ehrman would like us to believe that crucified victims still don't get proper burials, but, you know, I still beg to differ what his argument actually is. And then we'll give some examples of deterrents against tomb robbery and or necromancy. We're probably not going to go over the terracotta army in ancient imperial China, only because it's so removed from the Mediterranean culture, and probably it doesn't have any relevance to our investigation in terms of a Christian apologist. And the possible actual guards assigned to Greco-Roman graves, and the Nazareth Inscription. Alright, so Matthew's empty tomb guards. So the guards at the empty tomb serve and have served the polemic against the stolen body hypothesis. If there were no guards, the opportunity for body displacement either by authorities, disciples, or grave-robbing necromancers increase. And past works utilize the empty tomb guards as a Christian apologetic focus on Matthean internal consistency, namely the work of Dr. Andrew Loke. Dr. Craig Evans kind of went the direction I would have liked. He is an expert on ancient Jewish burial practices, although he admits that a strong skeptical case can be made against the guards at the tomb. In the book How God Became Jesus, Dr. Craig Evans actually gives a whole slew of information and archaeological references for why the burial of Jesus is likely to be historical. It was sort of like a 4-man team up against Dr. Ehrman's How Jesus Became God. So that was pretty lit. The empty tomb guards has often been neglected since it is not as best multiply attested by ancient sources. It only shows up in Matthew's gospel and not in the other gospels or even Paul's writings. If you guys have been on this channel before, you guys will know that I tend to take the scholarly consensus regarding two-source hypothesis and the relationships between the Synoptic Gospels. A naive interlocutor may suppose that Luke and John omit Matthew's narrative, which itself is an addition to Mark. Remember, the timeline for two-source hypothesis is Mark, Matthew, Luke, and then John. However, if you look over here to the diagram left, Mark and Q are written roughly about, well, we don't actually know when they were written, but they were compiled contemporaneously to form Matthew and Luke. Mark is unfinished, so that's the reason why he wouldn't add, you know, an empty tomb guard, because he's rushing to finish his gospel. Luke just straight up had different sources and was writing contemporaneously with Matthew, and then John is just straight up theological reflection, a different genre, if you will, according to the works of Harold Atteridge. Counterarguments from the guard at the tomb, William Lane Craig. This is taken from the Reasonable Faith's website. Matthew is not clear if Pilate gave them a Roman guard or told them to use their own temple guard. Just some things to take into consideration for. The Gospel of Peter uses a Roman guard and is probably read into the tradition as may be designed to emphasize the strength of the guard. The guards returned to the chief priests as evidence that a Jewish guard is intended. But some theologians are appalled that pagan guards might see the risen Christ. The account says nothing about any appearance of Jesus to the guards as a motive for guarding it, only that it is a relevant fact to consider. Perhaps the most serious difficulty with the guard story, however, is that if the disciples did not grasp the importance of the resurrection predictions, then the Jews who had much less contact with Jesus would not have grasped them either. But my contention for today's presentation is namely going to highlight this one sentence that William Lane Craig proposes. It is possible that the actions of the Jews were not motivated by knowledge of the resurrection prophecies at all, but were simply an afterthought to prevent any possible trouble, namely grave-robbing necromancers, that could be caused at the tomb by the disciples or anyone else during the feast. Jesus' public figure had plenty of notoriety, so it is not unreasonable to suggest that even someone like Jesus, who wasn't like an emperor with a whole mausoleum, would have had people at least being custodians for his tomb, and especially chief priests, if you're talking about someone else's tomb, namely Joseph of Arimathea. Roman law and tomb robbery. How is it enforced? If you're familiar at all with anything with Greco-Roman antiquity, burials were taken seriously. Outside of Palestine, the use of pyres and burning corpses was common, but regardless, it was still regarded as a sacrilege not to give someone an honorable burial. Well-known inscriptions warns of severe penalties for anyone who disturbs the tomb, implying that the community or local authorities were vigilant. With some exceptions, you don't typically see custodians or tomb guards, but the very fact that grave-robbing necromancers were an issue in Greco-Roman antiquity, and that people made reference to fines, to rewards for people who reported grave robbery, implies that people were vigilant. The community was vigilant in looking out for these grave robbers in their own graveyards. Religious and supernatural beliefs in divine punishment and the sanctity of the dead served as powerful deterrents. Many people believed that disturbing a tomb would bring bad luck, divine wrath, or hauntings. I'd like to defer to the works of Kaja Harder, constantly make reference to demons and spirits guarding tombs, and that anyone who were to violate these tombs would be accursed. The takeaway from the slide is that it was highly negatively viewed to be grave robbing a tomb for necromancy or stealing jewelry or other purposes. Generic tomb inscriptions and edicts. So yeah, like throughout the Mediterranean, from Egypt to Greece and Rome, these inscriptions, as I said, commonly curse anyone who would desecrate them. The Romans had strict laws against tomb robbery, once again showing that the tomb robbery not to be taken lightly, and the punishments could range from fines to more severe penalties like forced labor or even capital punishment, depending on the gravity of the offense. So a lot of these come from the Justinian Digest, Book 47, Title 12, and Book 9, Title 19. They list a bunch of other primary sources belonging to the time of the Roman Empire, and this is just half of them I have listed over here. But similar to the Romans, the Greeks also had laws and cultural practices aimed at protecting tombs. Inscriptions and curses were common, and the violation of a tomb was considered a serious offense. Egyptians had detailed laws and harsh punishments for those robbing graves. Despite this, many tombs, including those in the Valley of the Kings, were looted. Eventually. There are instances where actual guards, were employed to protect tombs, particularly those of the elite. Papyri from the Ptolemaic and Roman periods mentioned guards being stationed at tombs, especially during construction or renovation periods. The high value of the grave goods in Egyptian tombs made them attractive targets for thieves, necessitating some form of protection. So we can also delineate a parallel in the Gospels where Jesus was anointed with many, many spices, which would provide a good impetus for the local community to be guarding its graveyard. Papyri Leopold II Amherst of the 26th Egyptian dynasty details about the measures taken to protect tombs, including the assignment of royal guards or medjays. Alright, now we're going to talk about Jewish burial customs. So I'm going to go quickly over this. You guys already probably have seen my big hit piece on the empty tomb. where I list 6 historical critical reasons for why the empty tomb of Jesus was historical. Crucified victims, contrary to popular belief, were eventually buried identifiable in 1st century Palestine and or Judea. And we're going to see why Bart Ehrman's argument doesn't exactly work. The pre-Mark and Passion narrative lacks legendary development. Joseph of Arimathea is an unlikely character of Christians to invent. Paul gives attestation to the burial tradition in 1 Corinthians 15. The Jerusalem factor, that is to say, inhabitants of Jerusalem didn't dispute the empty tomb despite having every opportunity to disprove it. Women testimony as an unlikely invention of a patriarchal society. Crucified victims, Ehrman on Yehohanan.
So do we have remains of crucified victims?
Yeah, so this is another argument people have used. Archaeologists have found remains of people who are definitely crucified. And these have been used to show, oh, well, people did get decent burials. Because look, we've got the remains buried. So there it is. So, so Ehrman, you blew that one. We got archaeological evidence for it. More recently, they've discovered something in England, actually, from roughly the time. It is true that these people were buried. What we don't know is, when were they buried? They found the skeleton. They found the bones. But how long were the bones hanging on a cross before they were buried? There's nothing to suggest that they were buried that afternoon. And so they could have been on the cross for 2 weeks. And then finally an authority said, okay, you can have the body now, what's left of it. And they took it and they gave it a burial. So that's completely possible. My contention is that Romans did with Jesus what they did with every other crucified person we know about.
So yeah, this is the thing, right? So I'm honestly trying to steelman Dr. Ehrman with the clip I just played. So he's saying that, okay, we don't know the time of the burial. Okay, so let's suppose that it was buried. We still would be able to identify the body, like, in general. Yehohanan's ossuary itself has a name attached to it, implying that it was identifiable in some regard. I mean, like, dude, come on, man. The lengths that skeptics are willing to go to just try and disprove the Gospels is saddening, to say the least. Jesus' cross was identifiable according to the Gospel narratives. The King of the Jews sign claiming to be the Messiah, etc. According to Dale Martin, is perhaps a historical nugget because it matches, I believe he says it matches the criterion of dissimilarity because it was not a common title Christians used to venerate Jesus with, like Christ or Lord, etc. Criminals were buried separate from non-criminals anyway. And then here are some examples of actual deterrents against tomb robbery and or necromancy. So as I mentioned before, the Caesars had several mausoleums. Hadrian, Augustus, Caligula. The castle Sant'Angelo was built as a mausoleum for Emperor Hadrian, while direct evidence of guards is not documented for some of these mausoleums, although it is documented for Trajan's column. It clearly had funerary custodianship, and we have evidence of that in several epigraphs. The importance and grandeur of such a site suggests that it would have been protected, at least temporarily, during and after the burial to prevent desecration or looting. Legal language and grave inscriptions imply real-world consequences for getting caught grave robbing, and the further possibility that people could catch you grave robbing, otherwise they're making reference to an impossible scenario that has no relevance to them, which they spent like many denarii just trying to carve out on the inscription. Oh yeah, if you do find a grave robber, it's like that wouldn't make sense if they had no capacity to find grave robbers. So that's that. So yeah, here's a quote from Kaja. Among around 280 grave inscriptions with relevant legal content, there are around 75 documents for the recipients of the fines. So yeah, we have tons of inscriptions with relevant legal content, and they make reference to things like fines and real-world consequences, not just like, oh yeah, you're cursed by the gods, or whatever. There are even some inscriptions awarding denarii to persons reporting grave robbery. And during the Second Temple, as we all know, Jews had this eschatological understanding of the resurrection of the dead, and henceforth they had elaborate burial practices in ossuaries, bone boxes, that may have been safeguarded by community practices in respect for the dead. I don't envision Joseph of Arimathea making his tomb somewhere unknown, so that's that. So yeah, we're going to look at some clips regarding the Nazareth inscription.
This is an inscription on a marble slab that's from Nazareth, dated to the reign of Claudius in the 40s to 50s, with an edict from Caesar prescribing death for anyone caught stealing bodies from a tomb. For a lot of people, this is a kind of indirect proof for the resurrection, because it means the emperor has heard about Jesus's resurrection, and his immediate reaction is to say, well, we've got to put a pin in this. So he's got this decree saying, obviously we've got to stop having bodies being stolen from tombs, because that's obviously what had happened.
Around 41 AD, which is less than 10 years after the resurrection. And amongst many things that's written on it, it's written in Greek text, you can see it there on the screen, it makes robbing bodies from tombs illegal, and it institutes the death penalty for not tomb robbing like artifacts or gold, but bodies. It specifically mentions robbing bodies from tombs.
Now, isn't that odd?
It's a very odd, it's a very unusual punishment for something like that. Robbing tombs is a common thing in the ancient world, but not robbing bodies from tombs. Besides the obvious problems with trying to take a dead body out of a tomb, decomposition and all that, what purpose would a person have for taking a body out of a tomb? And if we recall the biblical account, where the Sanhedrin tells the guard, tell them you fell asleep and the disciples came and stole the body. So we can see a direct connection between the biblical account of the Sanhedrin trying to explain away the empty tomb and then it finding its way into Roman law. The Romans believed that the resurrection was a lie, and the only explanation they come with is somebody stole the body and created this uproar throughout the whole Roman Empire. We can't let this happen again. So the emperor had this edict sent out. The inscription is in a shortened form of a larger imperial edict, but nonetheless, it was found in Nazareth, which is no coincidence, where Jesus was from.
Amen.
So there's various pieces of evidence that really fit here together that really point to the resurrection. Less than 10 years, tomb robbing, not just artifacts, but a body from a tomb. It also mentions what's called sepulchral sealing tombs, which is a particular type of tomb only really found in Palestine, in Israel. Most people throughout the Roman Empire were buried more conventional, or they were cremated. So this would not be a Gentile practice. This would be a specific practice done by Jews. So you can tell that the edict is pointing particularly not just to the empire, but particularly to Israel.
Amen.
So it really points again back to the resurrection.
There's also debates about the provenance and dating of the Nazareth inscriptions. I think some have argued or asserted that the limestone comes from, I think, the Greek island of Kos, and there's people who think it may be dated some other time.
Now, some quick observations on my side of things. One, it mentions the imperial ruler as Caesar, which was not like a long-standing tradition until a couple of decades, I believe, after Augustus had died. But it's not like Augustus during his lifetime was called Caesar, to the best of my knowledge, but I could be wrong on that. Some people like to say that, because we found some radioactive isotopes that match some, stone quarries in the reign of Augustus, Greece. And it's like, bruh, a lot of the stones in the Second Temple, especially marble, were moved from other places. So for some future research, I like to straight up have a more exhaustive literature review. I mean, it's kind of hard navigating these databases like CIL and like epigraph, whatever, in German, like some random German university database. Yeah, and then like knowing what to click and like having to translate it, yeah, it's kind of frustrating. A better analysis on stone quarries and the Nazareth Inscription. Some suggest any marble would necessarily have to come from elsewhere, probably a location on the route from Rome to Judea. Some suggest poor Greek make it unlikely that the inscription was made in a Greek-speaking area. And another possibility I would like to point out is, the stone could be all the way back in Kos, Greece, but the actual inscription could be after that stone was created. And yes, please, an English translation of Kaja's German works. Her research on academia.com largely has to do with deterrence against tomb robbery. Guards at Jesus' tomb weren't necessarily just trying to falsify his resurrection. They were just there just to protect against common grave robbery or just trouble that might espouse due to Jesus' predictions regarding his death. Jesus often spoke in parables, so much to the point where his own disciples had to ask when was he speaking in parables or not. It wouldn't be a surprise that Jesus actually predicted his own death and at the same time doesn't require actual knowledge of the resurrection about to come. So thank you all guys for watching. Hope you guys stay tuned. That's your boy Paul signing out. Peace.